I received this email about a week ago from a guy named Marcus, and it's one of those stories that makes you want to turn on every light in your house and double check that your front door is actually locked. Marcus worked as a night shift nursing assistant at a place called the High Point Convalescent Center, a facility tucked away in a part of the country that most people only see when they're lost or low on gas. He included a few scans of some handwritten logs that I've spent the last few days trying to verify, and while the facility itself officially closed down 2 years ago, the details Marcus provides about what was happening in the basement wing are something I can't stop thinking about. It's a long, slow descent into something I can only describe as a bureaucratic nightmare, so I'd suggest you settle in and listen closely to every detail. Because by the time he finds the patient chart with his own signature from 30 years ago, you'll realize that High Point was never just a hospital. The most important rule in the night shift handbook at High Point wasn't about medication errors or fire safety. It was Rule 14, which stated that if a patient in the West Wing mentioned a red-haired woman in a white dress, I was to immediately record it as a stage 4 auditory hallucination and was strictly forbidden from entering the room for at least 40 minutes. I remember reading that in the break room during my first week, sitting under a flickering fluorescent light that hummed with a low, vibrating frequency that made the back of my skull ache. I'd taken the job because the pay was $75 an hour, which was an absurd amount of money for a CNA position in rural Pennsylvania, especially for a guy like me who was just trying to finish his degree without drowning in debt. The facility was a sprawling, brick and stone Victorian-era hospital that had been converted into a long-term care center for patients with complex cognitive conditions, which I soon learned was just corporate speak for people the rest of the world had forgotten about. My supervisor was a woman named Evelyn, a veteran nurse who moved with a kind of heavy, mechanical efficiency and whose eyes always seemed to be looking at something 3 inches behind my head. She didn't offer much in the way of a warm welcome. She just handed me a set of keys, a pager that looked like it had been manufactured in the late 80s, and a stack of charts that were so thick they were held together with rubber bands. "Stick to the schedule, Marcus." She told me that first night, her voice as dry as old parchment. "Don't talk to the patients more than you have to. They get confused and confusion leads to agitation, and agitation makes my job harder. And for God's sake, stay out of the basement annex unless I'm with you." I asked her what was in the annex, and she just adjusted her glasses and stared at the monitors. "Files," she said. "Just old files that nobody wants to deal with." The first few shifts were boring in that specific, eerie way that only a hospital at 300 a.m. can be. The air was a mix of antiseptic, industrial lavender, and that peculiar, sweet smell of old soup that seems to cling to the walls of care facilities. I'd do my rounds, check the vitals of the 15 patients on my floor, and then sit at the nurse's station and try to study. But the inconsistencies started showing up early. I checked the chart for a patient in room 202, a man named Mr. Henderson, and the records would state that he had been admitted in 1994 for early onset Alzheimer's. That would make him at least in his 80s. But when I walked into the room to check his breathing, the man in the bed looked like he was in his late 30s. He was staring at the ceiling with wide, unblinking eyes, and when he saw me, he didn't look confused. He looked relieved. "Is it time for the transfer?" he asked, his voice clear and resonant. I told him it was just a routine check, and he sighed and turned away. "Tell Evelyn I'm ready. The room is too small now." I brought it up to Evelyn the next morning as we were doing the shift change. I told her Mr. Henderson looked awfully young for a patient who'd been there for 30 years. Evelyn didn't even look up from her paperwork. "Some people age differently, Marcus. It's the medication. It preserves the cellular structure. It's all in the files." She was dismissive, almost bored, which only made my skin crawl more. It was as if she was reading from a script she'd memorized years ago. The other nurses were the same way. They moved through the halls like ghosts, rarely speaking to each other, their faces fixed in expressions of total, wary neutrality. No one joked, no one complained about the coffee, and no one ever mentioned the patients by their first names. It was like I was the only person in the building who was actually awake. About 2 weeks in, I had my first encounter with Rule 14. I was sitting at the desk when the call light for room 214 started blinking. It was Mrs. Gable, a sweet-faced woman who usually spent her nights sleeping soundly. I went to the door, but before I could enter, I heard her talking. "Oh, you're back?" she said, her voice sounding small and frightened. "The dress is so bright tonight, but I don't want to go to the basement. I like it here. I like the window." I froze, my hand on the doorknob. I remembered the rule. I checked my watch. It was 10 a.m. I stood there, listening as Mrs. Gable started to sob, a quiet, rhythmic sound that broke my heart. I wanted to go in, to tell her she was safe. But then I remembered the way Evelyn had looked at me when she'd handed me the handbook. There was a coldness in this place that felt deliberate, a sense that the rules weren't there to protect the patients, but to protect the reality of the staff. I waited 40 minutes, just like the book said. When I finally entered the room, it was empty, not just empty of people. The bed was made, the personal photos were gone, and the air was cold. Mrs. Gable was gone. I ran back to the nurse's station and looked at the census. Mrs. Gable was still listed as being in room 214. I paged Evelyn, and she arrived 5 minutes later, looking as unruffled as ever. "Where's Mrs. Gable?" I asked, my voice shaking. "She was just here. She was talking to someone, and now she's gone." Evelyn walked into the room, looked at the empty bed, and then turned to me. "She was transferred, Marcus. I told you, we move patients when their condition changes. You must have missed the order in the computer." I told her that was impossible, that I'd been at the desk the whole night, and no one had come through the doors. Evelyn just walked over to the terminal, typed in a few commands, and showed me the screen. There it was, patient Gable, Martha, transferred to Annex, 2:50 a.m. The Annex. Again, that word was starting to sound like a death sentence. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed up in my small apartment, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the way Mrs. Gable had said, "The dress is so bright." I decided that during my next shift, I was going to find out what was in the basement. I brought a small, high-powered flashlight and a set of heavy-duty pliers, just in case the keys Evelyn gave me didn't work on the lower levels. The shift started normally enough, but the atmosphere felt even more suffocating than usual. The hum of the lights felt louder, and the patients seemed more agitated, a chorus of low moans and restless shifting echoing down the long, dark corridors. At 3:00 a.m., Evelyn told me she was going to the pharmacy wing to do a count, and that I was to stay at the desk. As soon as her footsteps faded away, I grabbed my gear and headed for the service elevator. I'd never seen anyone use it, and the buttons were worn down to the brass. I hit B and waited. The elevator moved with a slow, grinding shudder, the cables groaning in the shaft. When the doors opened, I was met with a wall of cold, damp air that smelled of wet stone and something metallic. The basement wasn't like the rest of the hospital. There were no white tiles or bright lights. It was a labyrinth of rough, hewn stone walls and heavy iron doors, lit only by a few dim bulbs hanging from the ceiling. I started walking, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I passed rooms filled with old iron bed frames, stacks of yellowed newspapers, and crates of medical equipment that looked like they belonged in the 19th century. Then I found it, a door with a small, brass plate that read an Annex P8 iron recordes. It was locked, but the key Evelyn had given me for the supply closet fit perfectly into the lock. I turned it, the mechanism clicking with a heavy, satisfying sound, and stepped inside. The room was massive, filled with rows upon rows of filing cabinets that stretched into the darkness. I walked to the section labeled with the current year, but the folders were empty. I moved back further, my flashlight scanning the labels. 2010, 2000, 1990. I stopped at the 1980 section. I don't know why, but I felt a pull toward it. I pulled out a drawer and started flipping through the files. I found Martha Gable. Her file was thick, filled with progress notes and medication logs. But as I read, my blood turned to ice. According to the records, Martha Gable had been a patient at High Point since 1982. She had been transferred to the Annex every 5 years, only to reappear on the second floor a few months later with a new admission date. It was a loop. They were recycling her. But that wasn't the part that broke my mind. I kept digging, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped the flashlight. I found a file near the back of the drawer, a folder that was newer than the others, despite being in the 1986 section. I opened it and saw a photograph of a young man. He was wearing the High Point CNA uniform, and he was smiling at the camera. It was me. Not someone who looked like me. It was me. The name on the file was Marcus Thorne. The date of hire was July 14th, 1986. I read the notes in the file, my eyes darting across the page as I tried to make sense of the words. Employee Marcus Thorne shows excellent aptitude for the transfer process. His vital signs are stable, and his cellular retention is at 98%. Recommendation: full integration into the annex cycle upon completion of his 5-year term. At the bottom of the page was a signature, confirming that the employee had read and understood the terms of his long-term engagement. The handwriting was mine. It was the same jagged, slightly slanted cursive I've had since I was a teenager. I stood there in the dark, the silence of the basement pressing in on me, and I realized that I wasn't a student working a temp job. I was a part of the inventory. High Point didn't just care for the elderly, it was a closed system, a place where people were kept in a state of perpetual, artificial stasis, their lives harvested and reset whenever the cellular retention started to fade. That's why the pay was so high. That's why the rules were so specific. Rule 14 wasn't about a ghost. It was about the moment the reset happened, the moment the version of you that was done was taken away to make room for the one that was just beginning. I heard a sound behind me, the slow, rhythmic click of heels on stone. I turned, my flashlight beam catching Evelyn standing in the doorway. She didn't look angry. She didn't look surprised. She just looked tired. "I told you to stay at the desk, Marcus," she said, her voice echoing in the vast room. "It's much easier if you don't look at the files. It makes the transition so much more stressful for the psyche." I backed away from her, my heart hammering against my ribs. "What is this place, Evelyn? Who am I?" She walked toward me, her face softening into something that almost looked like pity. "You're Marcus, dear. You've always been Marcus. You've been the night shift CNA at High Point for 42 years. You're our most consistent worker. You just reached the end of your current cycle a bit earlier than usual." I asked her about the 1986 file, about the photograph. She sighed and leaned against a filing cabinet. "We have to reset the staff too, Marcus. If we didn't, you'd start to notice that the patients never age. You'd start to ask questions that we can't answer. Every 5 years, we give you the tea that helps you sleep, and we move you to the annex for a few weeks. When you wake up, you're 22 again, you're a student, and you're ready for your first day at High Point. It's a perfect system. You get to live your youth over and over again, and we get a worker who knows the routines in his bones." I realized then that the metallic taste in my mouth every morning, the memory gaps, the feeling that I knew the patient's needs before they even spoke. It wasn't intuition. It was muscle memory. I'd done this thousands of times. I looked at Evelyn, and for the first time, I saw the truth. She wasn't an old woman. She was ancient. Her skin was a map of 1,000 cycles, a patchwork of resets that hadn't quite taken. She was the anchor of the whole facility, the only one who was allowed to remember. "I'm not staying," I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "I'm leaving this place." Evelyn just shook her head. "You can't leave, Marcus. The sensors are tuned to your specific frequency. If you cross the perimeter, the cellular degradation will accelerate. You'd be dust before you hit the main road. The only way to survive is to stay within the field. The only way to live is to forget." She held out a small paper cup, the kind they use for medication. Inside was a dark, aromatic liquid. "Drink the tea, Marcus. It's time for your break. When you wake up, the debt will be gone. The degree will be almost finished, and you'll have a fresh start." I didn't drink it. I ran past her, pushing her aside and sprinting toward the service elevator. I didn't go back to the second floor. I took the elevator to the roof, thinking I could jump, thinking I could find some way out of the field she talked about. I stood on the edge of the stone parapet, looking out at the dark woods that surrounded the facility. The air felt different up there, thin and cold. I looked at my hands, and I saw them starting to change. The skin was wrinkling, the liver spots appearing before my eyes. My breath became a wheeze. My joints started to ache with a fire I'd never felt. I realized she wasn't lying. My youth was a product of the building. Without it, the 42 years I'd actually lived were catching up to me in seconds. I collapsed on the gravel, my vision blurring, my heart stuttering in my chest. I could hear the elevator doors opening behind me. I could hear Evelyn's footsteps. She knelt beside me and placed the cup to my lips. "It's okay, Marcus," she whispered. "The dress is so bright tonight, isn't it? Just let go. We'll see you at 1100 p.m. for your shift." I drank the tea. I didn't have a choice. The alternative was a death that felt like it had been waiting for me for decades. I woke up in my apartment 3 hours ago. My head is pounding, and I have a strange metallic taste in my mouth, but I feel great, energized, young, and ready to take on the world. My tuition bill is sitting on the desk, and I've got just enough in my savings to cover the next semester. I found a note on my nightstand in my own handwriting, telling me to be sure to read the employee handbook before my first shift tonight at High Point. It says the pay is $75 an hour. I'm a little nervous, but I've always been good at taking care of people. I have this weird feeling that I'm going to be really good at this job. The most disturbing part of Marcus's email isn't even the hospital or the resets. It's the fact that he sent it to me from an iPad that was logged into a guest network at a facility that, according to public records, burned to the ground in 1992. I tried to trace the IP, and it leads back to a coordinate in the middle of a forest where there isn't a single building for miles. It makes me wonder how many people are out there right now, living their fresh start in a place that doesn't exist, serving patients who died decades ago. If you ever see a job posting for a position that pays way too much in a place that feels like it's frozen in time, maybe ask yourself if you're looking for a career or if you're just the next item on the inventory. Let me know what you think in the comments, especially if any of you have ever worked the night shift and felt like you'd been there before. A subscriber named Julian sent this in, and he included a series of scanned handwritten notes that he found inside a sealed emergency medical kit at a remote research station in the High Sierras. I've checked the coordinates he provided, and while there's definitely a facility up there, it's not listed on any public Forest Service maps, and the organization Julian supposedly worked for has no digital footprint whatsoever. This isn't your typical ghost story or a standard cabin in the woods trope. It's a detailed account of a man who realized that his reality was being edited in real time, and after reading it, I think you'll understand why Julian hasn't been back to his home in over 6 months. I've been watching a video feed of myself sleeping for the last 3 nights, but the camera that's recording me doesn't actually exist. I know how that sounds, and believe me, I've spent hours tearing apart the ceiling tiles and checking the smoke detectors in my quarters at the Viridian Atmospheric Station, but there is no lens, no wire, and no transmitter. Yet, every morning when I log into the main server to check the overnight barometric data, a file titled Sleep Studied Julian is sitting there on the desktop. When I open it, I see a high-definition, black and white feed of me tossing and turning in the bed behind me. The angle is from the corner of the ceiling, right above the door, but when I stand on my chair and touch that exact spot, there's nothing but smooth, cold industrial paint. I took this job because I needed the isolation. I'm a meteorologist by trade, and after a messy divorce and a stalled career in the city, a 6-month contract at a high-altitude research post seemed like the perfect way to reset. The pay was incredible, nearly 3 times the industry standard, and the responsibilities were minimal. Monitor the weather balloons, calibrate the sensors, and report any significant shifts in ozone density. The station itself is a brutalist concrete cube perched on a ridge about 4 hours away from the nearest town. I'm the only one here. Or at least, I was supposed to be. My first week was perfectly normal. I established a routine coffee at 600 a.m., sensor checks at 800, and data transmission at noon. My only contact with the outside world was through a weekly satellite call with a man named Kessler, my supervisor at the Viridian group. Kessler was a man of few words, always sounding like he was speaking from the middle of a windstorm. He never asked about my well-being, only about the integrity of the data. Everything was fine until the 8th day, when I found the first inconsistency. I was checking the inventory in the pantry, and I realized that I had 12 cans of peaches. I specifically remembered only having 4 because I hate peaches and wondered why they'd even been included in my rations. I shrugged it off as a clerical error until the next morning, when there were 24 cans, and the shelf they were on had been expanded to accommodate them. The wood was new, the nails were fresh, and I hadn't heard a single hammer strike during the night. I called Kessler that afternoon. "Hey, Kessler, I think someone's been up here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's gear and food appearing in the pantry that wasn't here yesterday." There was a long pause on the line, just the crackle of static. "Julian, the logs show you've had 24 cans of peaches since your arrival," he said, his voice flat. "You signed the manifest yourself." I told him he was wrong, that I'd checked the shelf twice. But he just repeated the same line and told me to focus on the ozone readings. I hung up feeling a cold knot of dread in my stomach. I went back to the pantry and checked the manifest. Sure enough, there was my signature, dated 2 weeks before I'd even left for the station, with a line item for 24 cans of peaches. The ink looked fresh, but the date was old. That night was the first time the video appeared. I had finished my work and was scrolling through the local drive to find a movie to watch when I saw the file. I clicked it, thinking it was a training video I'd missed. Instead, it was me. I was asleep, the blanket pulled up to my chin. About 10 minutes into the footage, the door to my room slowly opened. A hand reached inside, just a hand, pale and thin, and set a single peach on my nightstand. Then the door closed. I spun around in my chair, looking at my actual nightstand. There was the peach, fuzzy and orange in the dim light of my desk lamp. I hadn't heard the door open. I hadn't smelled the fruit. I grabbed the peach and threw it against the wall, watching it bruise and leak juice down the concrete. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, the wall was clean. There was no juice, no pulp, and no bruise. It was as if I'd never thrown it. I sat at my desk, staring at the spot, and that's when I noticed the clock on the wall. It was ticking backward. Not the hands moving in reverse, but the numbers themselves were shifting, rearranging their positions on the face. I looked at my phone, but the screen was just a blur of static. I decided then that I was leaving. I didn't care about the contract or the money, I just needed to get down the mountain. I packed my bag, grabbed my car keys, and headed for the heavy steel door that led to the garage. It wouldn't budge. Not because it was locked, but because there was no handle. The door was just a solid sheet of metal, welded into the frame. I know for a fact that I'd walked through that door every day to check the garage equipment, but now it was like the opening had never existed. I ran to the windows in the common area, but they were different too. They didn't look out over the ridge anymore. They looked out into a dense, grey fog that was so thick I couldn't see the glass. I pounded on the panes, but the sound was muffled, like hitting a mattress. I was pacing the hallway when I heard a voice. It wasn't Kessler, and it wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from the vents. "Julian, you're spiking the readings," the voice whispered. It sounded like a woman, calm and melodic. "You need to sit down and finish the calibration. The station needs the data to be clean." I stopped and looked up at the vent. "Who are you?" I yelled. "How did you get in here?" There was no answer, just the low hum of the HVAC system. I spent the next 4 hours searching the station for a hidden entrance, a crawl space, anything. I found nothing but more inconsistencies. My quarters had grown by 3 feet. The bathroom now had 2 sinks instead of 1. My favorite blue hoodie was now red. I went back to the server room, desperate to find a way to contact anyone. I found the Sleep Studied Julian folder again. I opened the latest file. In this one, I wasn't alone in the room. A figure was sitting in the chair at my desk, watching me sleep. The figure was me. It was wearing the red hoodie and looking at the camera with an expression of intense concentration. I watched the video of myself watching myself, and I felt a wave of nausea. The Julian on the screen stood up, walked to the bed, and leaned over the sleeping me. He whispered something into my ear, and then he looked directly at the camera and winked. I threw the monitor off the desk, but before it hit the floor, it vanished. It reappeared a second later, perfectly seated on the desk, the video still playing. I realized then that I wasn't just trapped in a building, I was trapped in a system that was correcting itself every time I tried to deviate from the script. I wasn't a researcher. I was the research. I decided to play along. I sat down and finished the calibration. I reported the ozone data to Kessler. When he called, I didn't mention the doors or the video. I just gave him the numbers. "Good work, Julian," he said. "The density is stabilizing. We might be able to bring you down early if this keeps up." I felt a flicker of hope, but it was extinguished when I asked him what the date was. "It's the 45th of October, he said. I stared at the radio. There is no 45th of October. But when I looked at the calendar on the wall, it was there. A long, vertical column of dates stretching down toward the floor, with October 45th circled in red. I started writing things down on pieces of paper I'd hidden in an old medical kit, hoping that whatever was editing the station wouldn't find them there. I wrote about the time I found a door that led to a staircase that went on for miles. I wrote about the day the fog outside the window cleared for a split second, and I saw that the station wasn't on a mountain at all, but was floating in a void of nothingness. I wrote about the man who appeared in the kitchen and ate dinner with me in total silence. A man who looked exactly like my father, but had no eyes. The most disturbing thing happened yesterday. I was in the common area, and I found a mirror. I hadn't seen a mirror in weeks. I looked at my reflection, and I didn't recognize myself. It wasn't that I looked older or different. It was that I looked unfinished. My skin was smooth and featureless, like a mannequin's. I had no eyebrows, no pores, and my eyes were just solid black discs. I touched my face, and it felt like cold plastic. I started to scream, but no sound came out. I opened my mouth, and I saw that I had no tongue. Just a small, black speaker nestled in the back of my throat. I ran back to my quarters and collapsed on the bed. I didn't sleep, but I pretended to. I wanted to see what the camera would do. I watched the corner of the ceiling, and for the first time, I saw it. A small, organic-looking eye opened in the drywall. It blinked once, the iris a vibrant, glowing purple, and then it focused on me. I stayed perfectly still. After an hour, the door opened. The Julian in the red hoodie walked in. He sat on the edge of the bed and touched my forehead. His hand was warm, unlike mine. "Don't worry," he whispered. "The transition is almost complete. You're becoming the data. You won't have to feel the static anymore." He leaned in closer, and I saw that his eyes were normal. He was the real Julian. I was the replacement. I was the one being edited into the station's permanent record. I waited until he turned his back to look at the nightstand, and I grabbed the heavy glass lamp from the desk. I hit him as hard as I could. There was no blood. He just shattered like porcelain, his body breaking into 1,000 white shards that dissolved into the carpet before they even settled. The eye in the ceiling rolled back into the wall, and the alarm on my phone started to go off. It's 6:00 a.m. now. I'm sitting in the common area, drinking a cup of coffee that tastes like copper. The door to the garage is back, but when I open it, there's no car. There's just a long, white hallway filled with rows of filing cabinets. I've been walking down that hallway for what feels like hours, and every drawer I open is filled with the same thing, a single, fuzzy orange peach. I've realized that I can't leave because there's nowhere to go. The station is the only thing that exists. Everything else, the mountain, the city, my divorce, it was just the background data they used to build me. I'm going to leave these notes in the medical kit and put it back in the vent. Maybe if the system resets again, it'll miss this. Maybe someone will find this and realize that the Viridian group isn't studying the weather. They're building a library of people, one edited moment at a time. I can hear the vent whispering my name again. It's time for the noon transmission. I have to go. My skin is starting to feel like concrete, and I'm worried that if I stay still for too long, I'll become part of the wall. Kessler called me 10 minutes ago. He said the ozone is perfect. He said I'm the best version they've had yet. I asked him what happened to the others. He just laughed and said they're in the pantry. I looked in the pantry just now. There are hundreds of cans of peaches, and on the back of each one is a small, high-definition photo of a man's face frozen in a silent scream. One of them looks a lot like me. I think I'm going to stop eating the peaches. I'm staring at the eye in the ceiling as I write this final line. It's not purple anymore. It's green. It looks like it's crying. Or maybe that's just the condensation on the vents. Either way, the static is getting louder, and I can't remember the color of my favorite hoodie. I think I'm ready to stabilize now. That story still gives me a weird feeling in the pit of my stomach, especially the part about the speaker in the throat. Julian hasn't posted anything online since he sent that email, and the Viridian group continues to be a total ghost in any corporate records I can find. It makes you wonder how much of our own memories are actually our own, and how much is just data that's been calibrated to keep us functioning. If you've ever worked a job where things felt just a little too perfect, or if you've ever found something in your house that you know you didn't buy, let me know in the comments. I'm starting to think that isolation isn't about being alone, it's about realizing you're being watched by something that can change the world while you blink. Stay safe and pay attention to the pantry.